Tēnā mai tātou, e mihi ana ki te mana whenua taranaki whānui, ke te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi. He mihi tēnei ko te Kāhui Whaihanga. He mihi ana ko te whari toi. Kia ora koutou, kua tai mai nei ki tēnei hui, ki te tautoko i ngā kaupapa i tēnei pō. Ko te tumanako, kia pai, tō wā, ki wainganui i a mātō. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, I'm Julie Cook. I'm an architect at Tennant Brown Architects, and I also sit on the Wellington branch of the Institute of Architects. I just wanted to give an acknowledgement to the mana whenua, Taranaki Whānui, and also to give thanks to the Institute of Architects and the City Gallery for the opportunity to have this panel tonight, and also take part in Aotearoa Festival of Architecture, which is happening this week. I will let the fellow panellists introduce themselves briefly, but essentially why we're here tonight is to discuss an event that we are planning to run in the city. We are very excited about having this event, and what we are wanting to do is to discuss our ideas and then look for any feedback, any questions, hoping to get some engagement from anyone in the audience, and then we can feed that back into how we plan to run the event. So the idea of the event, which you might have seen on the posters, Open Wellington, alludes to the fact that we want to open the city up to you. We want to showcase the city's built environment, create an opportunity for exploration of the buildings, the spaces and the neighbourhoods, make it open for the communities and for all people alike. Sort of playing on the curiosity of what's behind that door or what's something you haven't noticed before, and allowing people to get that little bit nosier about the city that they live in, to help engage a little bit in the spaces that they live. So as I mentioned, this talk is almost just about as much as about you as us, and yeah, hoping to hear from you. So what we'll do is we have a few discussion points we'll talk through, and then we'll open it up to the floor, so anyone from the audience who's got questions or feedback or any comments, please let us know. There'll be a mic being passed around, and yeah, we hope you enjoy the evening. And I will pass it over to Stuart, who's going to kick off on the why are we running an event like this. Thank you.
Perhaps we should introduce ourselves, each of us first. Just a thought.
And my fellow panellists will now introduce themselves. And Stuart, Kate and Gerald will give more background information around themselves. Thanks.
Oh, you want to start left to right? Okay. Kia ora. My name is Kate Lindsay, and I am here on behalf of the Wellington Architectural Centre, just the Architectural Centre. Got a bit of feedback. Not me. Sorry? Oh, right. So we are hoping that with the Architectural Centre to provide a bit of sort of structural support to this endeavour in terms of admin and stuff and people. Away you go, Stuart.
I'm Stuart Niven. I'm an architect, but also I've been an urban designer for the last 30 years. And I come from Wellington, but I've lived outside New Zealand quite an extensive period of time, 18 years in Australia, and I've been back about 4. In Australia I lived in Melbourne, and that's where I first encountered this open house program, because Melbourne has been running an open house program since 2008, and it's been phenomenally successful. probably that's all I want to say about me.
Gerald Blunt, Principal Advisor Design Strategy at Wellington City Council. Like Stuart, also architect, urban designer, although I haven't had the luxury of spending time or working in Australia. My work away was Auckland for 4.5 years away from Wellington, so a few things to learn from Auckland. But I suppose the main reason that I've been here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the two open houses or homes, however you say it, here in Wellington in the past. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But Stuart's going to give us the why.
A bit of repetition from what Julie was saying originally, but the original impetus for open house programs has been architectural, and that remains pretty much the case. And the intent being is to invite people into the best of the city's architecture, places that normally you can't get into. So those spaces are not just domestic; they're institutional. They're spaces to do with infrastructure in the city, and they're not just all necessarily internal spaces either. They could be some of the public spaces of the city which are either forgotten or not known about, or not visited very often. So it covers that full gamut, really. The open house program is based on three things. It's committed to being equitable. In other words, it's open to everybody, and that consequently it's largely free. It's accessible. So in other words, it makes every attempt it can to make the whole thing available to everybody to enjoy. I'm going to follow my notes here. So it's not just visual. It's about also listening to stories about places. So it's an overlay of visiting places, but also hearing about them in all kinds of unexpected and interesting ways. And although the program initially starts with visiting physical places, it also involves a program of talks about places that you can come to. It also involves taking walks through the city that are themed in terms of what you're actually looking at. But underlying all of that is the fact that these are places that you don't normally visit or haven't seen. So it's kind of peeling off the layers of the city for people. The point of it is to make the city more accessible and understandable for people. And the intention is that if that's real, if that's the practical effect of the open house programs, then people will feel more agency in terms of getting involved in the city or having opinions about it, rather than just being done to. And that has very much been the history of these programs when they've been applied in other cities. There are I think about 10 to 15 cities across the world now that have a formally endorsed open house program. We're not necessarily looking to sign up to that initially. We're looking to establish our own kind of persona first before we get involved in that. So yes, I guess really the key points here are it's a hidden city, and quite often these programs have started with private houses. And the impetus for it is people's curiosity. And if you can offer this kind of choice and people can get easy access, then curiosity is what drives it. So you feed off the curiosity with information, and you develop themes and programs around different parts of the city to do with mystery, basically.
I might just talk a little bit about two events that occurred here in Wellington. The first one was in 2005 as part of the Year of the Built Environment, and the Year of the Built Environment was an initiative that the then Minister for Urban Affairs, Marion Hobbs, was very keen to push, and it was worked off a Year of the Built Environment that was held in Australia. And the whole purpose of the program was about celebrating buildings, structures and open spaces and services that we take for granted across the country. So And the idea of open, we had the open home across New Zealand in 4 cities. The Ministry for the Environment, a colleague of mine, Anna Woods, and myself helped coordinate the opening of 40 different places, spaces, buildings, operations. So in Auckland, for example, we opened the wastewater treatment station. We opened the recycling operation up there. Also up there, we opened or provided access to the new Buddhist temple that had just opened in Mangere and was one of the most popular places to visit. In Dunedin, there was quite a focus on some of the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings across Dunedin that had just been recently redeveloped then. And in Christchurch, we looked at, and it's a bit sad to reflect, we had the Catholic Basilica or Cathedral open, as well as some of the buildings around Litchfield Lanes, which of course have all since gone. Here in Wellington, one of our buildings has gone, Church of Latter-day Saints. The Athfield Church in Willow Street is gone. But also here we looked at both sort of heritage buildings. We looked at different ways of living. So Chris Kelly, architect, had just recently completed his house in Oriental Bay. And we also visited Gerald Milling's Skybox in Egmont Street, which was quite a thrill to look at both of those. But also St Gerard's Monastery, Philosophy House, Waitangi Park had just recently been completed, so we were able to have Megan Raitt on site and telling the stories of the design behind sort of Waitangi Park. To put this together, and as I say, running this event across 4 cities was quite an undertaking. We did have funding and resource from the ministry, and we employed a project manager, so Grant Stevenson, who's an events manager from the Whiteboard, helped put that together. And in 2015, Grant pretty much single-handedly advocated to Wellington City Council and central government that we should celebrate the 150 years of Wellington being a capital city. And as part of that, he set up an event where he opened over 40 buildings across Wellington, not all government focused, but buildings like Parliament House and Government House, but then taking other buildings and really either telling the stories or using creative people to really bring the stories of those places alive. So in the National Library, he had a theatre company called Page Turner, who did a little sort of performance talking about the books and the stories that were in that place. He set up the Opera House with various sort of dance companies, Royal New Zealand Ballet, Opera Company, and they used over the weekend, the Opera House is their rehearsal sort of venue, so you could drop in and see various rehearsals. I think he got something like 80,000 visits across all of those 40-odd buildings in Wellington. Incredibly lucky with the weather. I suppose just sort of reflecting particularly back on the 2005 event, and interesting that we did not have open any buildings that were important to Māori. So that, I suppose, is a sort of a key learning sort of moving forward. So telling the Te Ao Māori story, because we had, as part of the narrative that went out, we were really trying to tell collectively the stories about how people had lived and both in the past and how they might live in the future. So that's sort of an interesting sort of perspective. So, but as Stuart said, I think it was really the opportunity for people to experience and go and see places and that people wouldn't normally know about, or just that curiosity about what happened behind that wall or that door or what have you. So, and again, I suppose tonight we're really keen to hear any ideas from you guys as to what you might sort of think or want to visit. So I'd hand over to...
Yeah, any secret hankering to open a door that you haven't been able to open before?
So the mechanism, I suppose, the question of how we actually run this festival, we've got, if we look at the festival, the current festival as a model, you know, you can have public lectures, you can have open buildings, you know, like open for a particular time, you can have walking tours. The way I'd been imagining it, projecting here, so feel free to disagree, was that we would have a series of curated self-guided tours, and then they'd be up and promoted for like a week or something, and then that would conclude with a presentation that would maybe tell you why that collection of curated spaces had been put together. And so we might have some mystery themes running where the link between the places was not necessarily immediately obvious. That was just a nice walk to take through the city, or ride your bike, or drive your car, depending on how distributed we wanted this project to get. So I dug around in my brain and came up with some weird ideas. And one thing that I would really love, because I'm not from Wellington, and I was never a student here, for example, but I know that when you're a student in a city, you always find those weird corners, the little undesigned places, you know, the corner of the car parking building, or the funny stairs that go up through the back of another place, or, you know, the secret link that joins one place to another. So I was kind of loved the idea of curating a series of those, and then have perhaps little audio snippets of people telling us what's fabulous about that undesigned space. I would love to know, because I'm constantly kind of going for a walk and getting lost, and then I discover a place and I think, oh, I wish I'd known about that when I was talking to someone else. So that was one that I thought might be good. Another one that we should, obviously, picking up on what Gerald was saying, is that sites of colonisation and adapting or transforming the narrative of those sites. So what might be the decolonising narrative that we introduced to colonised sites, and how we change our understanding or expectation of how those places within the city can be understood. And my third idea, because I realised there was this virtual city theme going on, my third thought was that we could have an unbuilt Wellington. So Stuart actually curated a show called Unbuilt Wellington, but that we could have a walking tour that was a whole lot of sites, and then you go along and you find the images, or get shown the images of what someone thought it would have looked like in 2020.
We've got really good documentation on this, so that to take it out of the gallery and take it out into the city would be an interesting thing to do. The other thing that's a bit of a challenge for us is that these programs are really popular. And I mean, when Melbourne started, they only opened 8 buildings in 2008, and they got 10,000 people. So they had queues. You know, you have to manage it, and nobody wants to hang around for half a day to get into a place either. So there's a really big logistic issue that has to be resolved around programs like this, and that's where a lot of our effort, I think, is going to go. They've usually been programs that are driven by a lot of people that have just put their hands up to wanting to be part of it, in terms of that organisational component to it. And we're looking to develop a similar kind of involvement in this city, with a lot of people who are prepared to give time to putting into the organisation of something like this. It excites me because, I mean, the first thing that I particularly remember about my first experience of open house in Melbourne was going down three floors beneath the ground through a big metal kind of cover on the street to a piece of late 19th century a pumping station, actually 3 stories down below the ground, with these amazing machines, which of course weren't working any longer, but they just looked extraordinary, and the thing was lit really well. It was really weird, but nobody ever knew that there was this thing there, or that there was no clue about it at all, and there it was, you know. And And that was a very constant theme in the Melbourne open home programs, that you were shown things that were surprising, that you didn't know even existed. You're also taken into spaces that are relatively famous, like the exhibition building, or for example Parliament buildings here or something like that. Now of course a lot of us have been into those buildings on and off, but maybe not to the point of looking around into every single nook and cranny. So even places that we think are familiar might not be quite so familiar. When it comes to outdoor spaces, I've had a long involvement with the development of the public waterfront in Wellington, and when we were doing that work in the mid-90s, Megan Wright and the two landscape architects that were working with us did an amazing amount of research about what actually had happened down the waterfront. And what Megan discovered was that at the southern end of Te Ara, east of Waitangi Park, was, well, we were told in terms of drawings we found that there was a graving dock that had been constructed because the whole edge of the waterfront at that stage was privately owned. And in the the early 19th century, a guy decided that he wanted to build a graving dock, to careen boats and basically to prepare them for the sea again. And so he had the land, he owned the land, and he excavated the graving dock almost to the point of it being finished, and then he went bust. And he filled it in. So there was no evidence of it anymore. In fact, the only reason we knew about it was because of this drawing that Megan found. So when we did some excavation on the waterfront at that point, we found it. So you can see it there today. You can see that boat-shaped channel that goes out to the sea underneath the walking bridge across. But we have no information to anybody to tell them about it. You would never know what it actually was. So once again, there's a lot of information about the waterfront that we can disclose that is not currently interpreted or in any way present on site. And that comes to the end of what we were going to say.
I'm just wondering if at this point, if any... No. Sorry about that. I'm just wondering if at this point, if there's any questions or feedback based on the discussion points that Gerald, Kate and Stuart have talked about. If anyone's got any questions for them, or maybe even any buildings or spaces that are have always sparked your curiosity and would be something that you would like to see more or be unlocked?
Hi, thank you. I'm not sure whether this is directly related, but because during the local government election, one of the Green Party candidates right now is a Wellington City Councillor, and she was talking about clearing. Basically she used quite strong words about tear down that sort of a historical or heritage building to clear space for the affordable, hopefully it's affordable housing, more housings for the maybe young people. And I wonder when these two needs conflict with each other, how do you actually find a balance and which one is more important?
There'll be a constituency for both. And there probably isn't a right answer, one way or the other. The thing about this program is that it highlights things like that. So part of the stories that are kind of conveyed or kind of exposed through the open house program are controversial. And controversies in the city. Maybe even not even controversies that are old ones, but ones that are like the one that you've mentioned that are contemporary. So the encouragement is for people to form an opinion about that and to be vocal maybe about it as well. That's also one of the aspirations of open house, that it encourages people to take part and get engaged in one way or another.
It'd be interesting to experience, if you could experience the old and new somehow alongside each other, that you can help you make some decisions as to which is better. And I think there's a interest, is it one thing or the other? That could be an interesting discussion as well, but how you might experience these.
I mean, there are also there are the presence of different cultures and groups in the city that have not exactly disappeared, but their presence is vestigial now, rather than being a really strong presence as it was in time past. So the areas around Hanning Street, which was a very strong part of Chinatown, part of the city, has almost completely disappeared, and yet the traces are still there. So the open house program takes that and begins to animate it and bring it alive again, so that you can see those traces, even if they're not all that evident to people that don't know about it. And there will be other communities in the city that have a similar engagement with the place that may have disappeared completely, but once again the open house program can bring that back into some kind of contemporary reality by telling the story about that in physical place.
Kia ora, thank you. This is really interesting, and this is a really fascinating discussion. And as an archaeologist and sort of interested in the culture, heritage and history of Wellington, I think it's very interesting, that concept of layers. And I think that is definitely something that would be really interesting to draw out in the case of Wellington. And again, like Kate, what you were saying about the different, what stories do you pull out, is thinking about layers of time, but layers of stories.
Yes.
And I think that is exactly what is unique about Wellington. And sort of taking aside, I think London is, but again, like you were saying, Stuart, in London you have these layers, we have buildings built on top of other things, but we also have that here. And I think people don't realise that.
We do, you're right.
Yeah, so I think that will be really fascinating, and I think the archaeology sector probably has a lot to add to that as well. So kind of weaving those stories in, and I think it's a matter of these paths, like pick your path.
Really like that idea of the layer, because there are layers everywhere.
Totally.
Really, I mean, there are also other, there are districts of the city. I mean, the most famous one is Cuba, but how many people have actually gone into every single aspect of the culture that makes up the Cuba Street area? Probably, I mean, we get invited to do that in a performative sense once a year through the festival, but if you're not young, you probably haven't experienced a lot of the small, discrete entertainment spaces in Cuba, which are really important to the nature of that space and the identity that it conveys to the city. I think there are going to be plenty of other examples of things like that as well.
I think what's quite interesting, just taking layers from the past, but also layers into the future. So a project that I'm working on through council is the redevelopment of Frankettes Park, and one of the things that our councillors have asked us to look at is a future Pacifica Whālei, and was having an interesting conversation this afternoon with colleagues about what is the idea of that new building representing a community that hasn't got a representation in this city. So and that story does come from the past, but how do we project? So the idea of decolonisation, for example, what does that look like, and how do we play with that? Having said all that, I'm not quite certain what that has to do with open house, but maybe again it's what we're learning from those layers and sort of building on and those sort of future.
But I think I sort of invite you to think about open space as well, like it's opening the house and opening the space and opening the place. And it's, those layers that people don't recognise and connecting those, and like that instance of Cuba Street, that's this perfect scenario of past, present and future.
Yes.
Like what is that space going to be in the future? And the Swan and Garrett Street project, that's some of that daylighting. So I think it's stuff that's already happening. And I think connecting the enclosed spaces and the open spaces would be a really interesting thing, because they're all, they influence each other. So yeah, I think that would be really fascinating.
Well, I mean, there's another contemporary issue that we've all been talking about ad infinitum the last couple of years, and that's density. So people talk about density, but I don't know how many people have actually experienced what it's like to live in an apartment or to live high up in the city as opposed to low. So that's another layer that you could begin to start to expose. And all the issues that come with that by actually being able to see the places or step into a a small apartment on the third or fourth floor, you know. I don't know that a lot of people in the city have had that experience. And there's a question coming.
Yeah, no, there's a question. Just a little bit more on the backstory, I guess, is that London actually was a very late adopter of the open house, and that actually it came from Amsterdam and Paris and Berlin had been going for several years before London caught on. But also the Architectural Centre here ran an open house festival for 3 years, I think 2005, 6 and 7 perhaps. And we had different themes each year. So one year was church buildings. So we opened up, I think, 20 different churches around and went into all of the churches, which was great. Another year was public and parliament buildings, which was quite interesting as well. And I can't remember what the third one was. Maybe it was commercial buildings. But one of the things that I remember about the London open house, one of the most popular ones, or the most popular one was the St Pancras before it had been done up. So it was that huge big Gothic pile. And it had been closed for 30 years, so people were really keen to see inside that, even though it was all rotting and things. But one of the other ones that nobody ever got into at that stage was the Masons, the Grand Temple of the Masons in Covent Garden, and that just had a queue out the door and down the street. Everybody wanted to see inside that, and if you want to see inside that, it's been featured in some of the Harry Potter films, so it's now used as a film set. But the link here, perhaps, is that we've got a number of Masons, lodges, Ancient Order of Buffaloes, the Ancient Antediluvian Order of Moose Watchers, or whatever they are, all of these weirdo secret cults. And one of the ones we had here last time was the not the Druids, but the weirdo secret cult, which is above the Wellesley Centre, I think. Maybe it was just Masons. They just done up. And that was one of the really popular things, because nobody knew about either their special weird activities and seeing all the paraphernalia. And they threw open their doors and said, you're all welcome to come in.
It's interesting, because you would have thought that people that are in that sort of situation are going to not be all that welcoming to open up their doors and let people in. But it's been my experience, certainly from my recollection of the Melbourne one, that there were people that were very, they were almost flattered to be asked, and were willing to do that. So it's got a dynamic about it which is not exclusionary, I guess. And my fear is that it's such a popular idea. How do you manage it? You know, how do you manage it so that the thing doesn't lose its luster by making a complete mess of it, by opening up too many places, by not handling it carefully in terms of logistics. So that's going to be one of the challenges we've got, really.
A thought I've had is something that I'd be interested personally in seeing is a little more prosaic. It's about the very technical functioning of the city. So it might be about, you know, why our infrastructure is collapsing, you know, water issues, electricity substations, how the transport system's managed, like how the signals work and things like that. I don't know what scope there is for letting people into those spaces, but that would be certainly something I would be interested in knowing. I think people might be interested in understanding how it works.
But that invitation to see those sorts of things has been incredibly popular. You know, for example, how the city manages its traffic. So you've got that room with those bank of screens that deal with every single intersection, and the way that the timing, it's almost like writing music at different times of the day to make sure that flow is easy. But nobody actually sees the engine room for that, or how that actually happens, and yet there is one. So I think that would be, and then to look at the bus system, you know, which we all experience as users and all have our opinions about, but we don't really understand the system or the people in it or what they think about it. So once again, it's finding a way of opening that up so that you understand it in terms of all the issues involved as well would be a really interesting thing to do, I think. I think actually the infrastructure issues are probably some of the more interesting things to look at, because they are generally hidden.
I've got a comment in the same area, actually, thinking about infrastructure. But the first question is around scope of the, in fact, geographical scope. You were talking about accessibility and so on before. Would this extend across the Greater Wellington region, or are you thinking just Wellington CBD, or what's your intention?
There's a little bit of tomorrow of the world to do with this, but I know, for example, once again, my experience of Melbourne, when they started small, they focused on the central city, they picked 8 buildings, and they got 10,000 people. Today, and this is sort of 10 years, more than 10 years later, it goes over 2 weekends, and they go right out to the burbs. So it's gradually spread from the centre where they started. So it's, once again, it's whatever you want to make it. And I guess every year you'd assess what you'd learnt from that experience. And each time you'd maybe introduce something different just to see how that worked. So it's, what's wonderful about a program like this is it's so incredibly varied. You know, there are so many different things that you could, or slices that you can make, or themes you can develop. And they don't, some of them will be very popular and you'd probably want to repeat them. Some that you want to introduce every now and then as something particularly special.
Yeah, perhaps it's already been canvassed, but the wastewater plant at Titahi Bay is rather remarkable. And yeah, I'd love to get inside it, walk past it from time to time. But things like that, I think, are big. I mean, because it does actually take a lot of the waste from Wellington, but it happens to be in a different city. So that kind of dynamic related to not just the physical infrastructure, but the social and perhaps, you know, spatial justice issues that arise from the infrastructures that we build and we have around us. That's, you know, could be an interesting conversation within this as well.
I guess my point to begin with was that it started with architecture, but it doesn't stop there. You know, in the sense, the relevance of architecture to this simply becomes, it's become the physical spaces that certain things happen. And so a lot of the layers we could talk about, a lot of the stories, are not necessarily conveyed through an architectural language or an architectural assessment. They're more to do with the social circumstances that buildings contain, as a system or as a culture, for example.
I wonder if there's not a counterpoint here we could look at in terms of thinking slightly differently how this is an opportunity for, without wanting to be political or politicising the process, but some provocations or an opportunity to crank the handle a little bit differently about how people think about the city and what are the subjectivities we bring to the city. Of looking at the city around saying, what are the undesirable elements in the city in terms of architecture, in terms of housing, in terms of things that don't work for the city, in terms of how people might engage with ways of looking at the city through what could be improved, rather than having sort of a narrow lens on what we like about it and what we see as being necessarily interesting and pleasing and aesthetic and so on. We could have a view that says there are things that don't work in the city. How do people respond to that? What do they think about that? What are their own subjectivities they bring to how the city could be improved through the lens of what doesn't work?
I mean, it could be, for example, a history of the evils. So, for example, the attitude towards liquor in the city from early times to present, which is a contemporary issue to do with Courtney Place for some people. But I don't think that this is all about a celebration. It's also about controversy as well. And controversy not just in contemporary time, but actually throughout the city's history, really.
One of those evils, Stuart, of course, could be architecture itself.
I mean, it's sort of quite interesting, just sort of listening to this sort of conversation, and I think the use of the idea of themes or what are we actually trying to do here, I think is quite interesting. So at Wellington City Council, for example, you know, we talk about issues around housing affordability, we talk about changing travel behaviour, we talk about the layers of what already exists, and the note that Robin Skinner's in the audience, but the layers of the old streams that exist, you know, in the city, and where do we find them? So it's telling this quite complex story, and all these things that, and often they're in conflict. So how do we sort of manage that? So how through this event, you know, that could be one way of doing it. You know, it could be the controversial side of the city, or the you know. So there's a number of different ways of cutting and dicing it, and I suppose part of this discussion tonight is, helping us sort of form, what that might look like. Yeah.
Oh, hi, and thanks. I'd like to put in a plug for public toilets. Because thinking about things like social space, gender, secrecy. I've never been into a women's public toilet, and I really would like to.
I've been into a
But,
few
you know,
men's and I just wouldn't go back again. The men's public toilets are really bad.
But there's also a social aspect to this, because the public toilet, as an institution up to about 1930s, 1940s, certainly once again in Melbourne, was a living room. There were people there that were staffed, there were fresh towels, all those things were supplied, and there were the spaces to sit. There was a restroom as well as the toilets and everything else. It was a whole kind of little social thing. And Melbourne closed them up and covered them over because they were thought to be out of date, and we didn't employ people to produce fresh towels and things anymore. And then after a while they produced these self-cleaning toilets, which ended up sitting on top of these wonderful things that were below, still full with tile work and everything else, which seemed to me to kind of beg the question a little bit. So yeah.
Yeah, there's when you think about layers and networks, I'm wondering how catchment management, for instance, because we live in a catchment, how catchment management intersects with gender. And we now have this kind of infinite gender spectrum, and the idea of the public toilet seems to intensify how we live as a public within social spaces. And there's lots of exclusion there and inclusion and issues associated with how to live and bodily functions and all sorts of interesting things, as well as the histories that you just mentioned, Stuart.
Yeah.
So I think that it's quite a possibility there. Thanks.
The other thing I like about a program like this is you don't have to solve anything. All that's necessary is to raise issues or to convey a bit of history. It's about the way that the public who are absorbing this and taking part in it react to that. It's the way that comes out in terms of issues that are raised independently of a program like this. So it's another one of the richnesses of the program, that it's not there to solve problems. It's there to convey in all of its texture and richness what a city is.
Kia ora. I was wondering if there's a health and safety nightmare, but wondering if there's scope to visit buildings being constructed so that you can see what's underneath and what's holding them up and how it works.
It's just a timing thing and lots of hard hats.
Yeah, lots of hard hats and timing. But I don't see any reason why that couldn't be the case. Especially if it was, for example, one of the new timber buildings.
Or the public library.
Or the public library, yeah.
Papa ran a very successful program of open days when the building was being constructed and lines out the board.
I mean, there's going to, we're in the middle of a precinct which is probably going to undergo quite a lot of focus and attention and interest in the next 4 to 5 years. We're in the middle of a precinct which is undergoing extraordinary change, not because it wants to, but because of earthquake strengthening, essentially. But there's a story to tell about this space. I mean, we dreamed about having the city square or that kind of precinct for about 50 to 60, almost 70 years. And finally, at a certain point in time, we got it. And we got it in an extremely comprehensive and interesting way. I know that because I was part of that process. So what I'm seeing now is a complete, almost frontal lobotomy about why certain things were done the way they were, why the square looks like the way it is, why the buildings around it have been positioned in the way they are. And that's a story that needs to be unfolded and laid out in front of people, because I don't think it seems to me it's been forgotten, which is a great pity, really. Not that things can't change, they have to change, but there's something that you probably don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
One thing that I'm just thinking about as I'm listening to all this is that there's a potentially really strong approach to raise this around a question or a contemporary issue, and then to look for similarities that have happened in the city in the past. So take, for example, Gordon Wilson Flats, which is a hot button topic in the city right now. Should it be torn down? Should it not be torn down? And then approach several buildings that were saved and several buildings that were torn down, and approach it as a tour to the city for people to make up their minds. You know, because a lot of times people think this is the first time a city's addressed this issue, and it isn't. And,
It's not.
and some people will say that tearing down some other thing, the thing that was placed, it was great. And some people will say that isn't it a shame that that's gone now? And I think it's totally, like you said, it's our job to raise the question and then let people make up their own minds. But doing that around a contemporary issue, I think, would be really powerful and would make people more interested. They would have a hook, they'd have a reason to be involved from the beginning, because they have a vested interest in something happening right now. This isn't about looking at things from the past.
Laura, I can think straight off of about 5 buildings
Yeah.
that all in their own time were completely threatened, almost on the verge of being pulled out. And through community action was saved and found a new use. It was never posited as a possible future at the time that demolition was being proposed.
And there might be another case where something was torn down and what replaced it was really great,
Yeah.
know? And so it's not just taking a side on an issue, it's actually just presenting multiple sides of an issue and letting people make up their own minds.
And I'll just pick up on that one in terms of buildings being demolished. And it was actually one of the reasons when I moved back from London to look at getting a group of very knowledgeable people together to kickstart an event like that is in London I got the opportunity to go through the Robin Hood flats about 6 months before they were demolished, because it was part of their open house festival. And I think it's that the ability to do that one last ditch attempt to see something before it's gone for good. And as you were saying, Lara, that also, you know, the more engaged you are in the city, do we have better advocates for keeping buildings that should remain? That if you understand why the building was, or the space was shaped how it was, do you facilitate more of the population to get behind it when there is a danger that it no longer exists? And following on from the London Festival, as Guy mentioned, which is particularly popular now and run over 2 weeks, is we have our backyard, very successful version in Christchurch, which initially started with 10 events and now 10 open spaces, and now I think they have over more than 50 this year. That's run over a weekend, so Christchurch have run that event very successfully, so we're looking to run a Wellington version very successfully. I think because we're such a vibrant city with support behind a lot of arts and culture and everything, that we've got that ability to bring that to architecture, to place, to people, to those connections and the environment that we built the city in. And also sort of raise more questions around the co-housing, medium density in the city. How do we get Kiwis to think of the backyard dream slightly differently, get them into living in the city in an apartment without showing them a way that they can live, a way that the city can be habitable and enjoyable to live in? How can we show them good spaces to live? And just have more understanding of how changes to the Lake Resource Management Act might affect them. And I think that can all sort of be brought into an event like this, where it just gives more awareness to the people of the city. This is not about award-winning architecture. This is about opening the city up to the non-architect's eye. It's about pulling out the infrastructure, the places that are unknown, the places that you might not really like, but you don't understand why they're built that way, and just giving a better understanding to the city, so then there's more of a voice when we try and shape it in the future. Yeah.
It's interesting, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of the Christchurch one, now they're open to nominations, so is that right? So across the city, there's a sort of a random sort of choice, and I suppose that in its collection helps define some of these sort of bigger questions about how you live in the future, or co-housing and density, and I suppose going back to what Guy was talking about when the architectural centre ran the open houses, very specific themes, churches and government buildings and whatever. So, that's a sort of, which way do we go? And I think that there's sort of, what we're hearing is a sort of more of a systems-based or network-based, or how this comes together to make the city a better place.
I mean, there's kind of an overarching thing, which is, how does the city work? And the city work in haphazard ways, sometimes in planned ways, sometimes not in planned ways, So by focusing on systems, for example, you begin to dig into exactly those sorts of themes.
Just want to throw another thing into the mix here, is that Wellington is obviously a famous harbour city, and the harbour is probably our greatest asset, but there's a whole another hidden world below the level that we walk on around the promenade. So if you go at low tide, you could have a tour, perhaps get one of the east-west ferries or something, and to do a tour around the edge and looking under, or even if you can get rubber boats or canoes and things, you can actually explore from where the Hikatea is. You can explore almost right up to the Circa Theatre.
You can go a long way in.
Yeah, and from the Kumatoto area, if you choose the tides right in a canoe, you can actually go all the way up to Woodward Street through the culvert if you're very brave.
Talk about health and safety nightmares.
Yeah, health and safety nightmares. But I mean, there's just, it's amazing. The world underneath the wharfs is such a different world. And when I'm doing some work down there, I was just amazed at how rickety everything is. Everything looks like it's going to fall down and die any second. But so it makes you a lot more careful about what you're walking on up above, but it's a really fascinating. I'm sure there's lots of...
So you can see that there's an incredible richness here that a program like this can feed off. And it never kind of runs out, really.
Sorry, this one might be very political again. I'm just wondering, because as we can see how San Francisco and New York, how they become quite a scary picture. And I see in Wellington, we got more and more homeless people. When we talk about inclusiveness, we like to house them, but we also know it's impossible to house everybody at the same time. How do you have some kind of solution, or maybe possible before it gets worse, or we just accept it to say this is a part of the city scene, and whatever, how it becomes, it's just a part of our life or part of city life. I mean, basically, maybe more like a Wellington City Council's plan of that. Did you see is it going to get worse when the economy is not good, or how you're going to accommodate that?
Everyone at once. That's not a truthful statement. It's absolutely possible to house everyone at once. And the power plays that operate in the city that cause some things to happen and other things to not happen are the kinds of stories that we're talking about when we want to talk about the history of colonisation and how decolonisation might occur across the city. It's not a simple story, and it's absolutely the sort of story of like, why are there some people with houses and other people without houses? When they closed the Gordon Wilson building, they threw 120 people out of their homes, just like that. And so that's an important part of that story. The Gordon Wilson as an empty tower block represents 120 homes that were lost in that moment. And it was, 2 weeks that those people were thrown out of their homes? So, derelict monument that is Gordon Wilson, at least, is representing what power is willing to do to people in the city. And Dixon Street as well. This is.
But if you were homeless, your experience of the city is a fundamentally different experience from most of us, and hardly any of us would only really get a sense of what that might be like. You know, the search for a place to sleep. What are the things that determine that? Well, I mean, we can see evidence of it, but actually putting yourself in the mindset of somebody that has to deal with the city from that perspective is something that's as real a part of the city as anything else. I don't know how a program like that could deal with that, because you don't want to stigmatise people either, you know. You don't want to put them in a spotlight and turn them into a specimen, but to talk about the city suggests that there's one experience of this place, and we all know that's not the case. There are many different experiences of the city.
Hi there. I just wondered, is there any sort of focus and drive on involving schools and school children, sort of talking pre-university, 15, 16-year-olds, because I guess they're the ones that will be stepping up into...
So the child's view of the city?
Yeah, I guess trying to get them involved and on these tours as well.
Yes.
I think the answer would be...
Let's put that on the list.
Yeah. London do a lot. They actually have sort of a side part of their open house festival, which is sort of branched out into a lot of education, and they have a lot of learnings and teachings around that. So it's definitely, I think it's a fabulous idea for us to think about to incorporate into this, because it is their city of the future. So how they see it is probably just as important, if not more important, than how we are living in it today. But
yeah, you get some really brutally honest feedback as well from them.
The three tenets of this program: equitable, accessible, and open. And those are not just physical things; they're social things as well. So, for those three principles to be on it, I think a lot of stuff opens up.
Actually, to continue from his previous question, I was thinking about how children play, you know, trees. And there used to be this tree at the top of the Northern Belt with a swing, and I think the council may have chopped down that tree. And I'd quite like to know the history of that tree. But obviously, the tree is not there, but it is. I was just thinking about hologram effect, just trying to push the boundary.
Well, I think of another classic example, not in this city, and that's One Tree Hill. You know, One Tree Hill, where the one tree isn't there anymore, you know, and yet the name's still there, and the memory is still there of it.
all right, I think we are needing to wrap up. So I just want to say ngā mihi kia koutou for all your input, some really, really interesting feedback and comments that we'll take on board and ponder away.
Yep, we're recording this.
Oh, yeah.
Every word is there for us.
So, just want to give thanks to you all for taking the time out and coming tonight and taking your time to give us some great questions, some great feedback. We are looking at having the event sometime next year, so details to come, but we've lit the fire, so we're going to keep it going, so keep an ear out. And once again, thanks to the Institute of Architects and the City Art Gallery for giving us this opportunity to sit here and be engaged with all of you.
And join us for drinks and nibbles in the foyer.